Welcome to this video where we're going to look at Juniper Mist authentication options when 802.1x is either not possible or not appropriate for your use case. In some previous videos, we've looked at configuring Juniper Mist Access Assurance solution using both EAP-TLS and EAP-TTLS. But in this video, we're going to think about when we want to authenticate clients which maybe don't support 802.1x, or maybe 802.1x isn't the right solution for your use case. So, for example, we might be wanting to configure IoT equipment, which is maybe has no way of configuring 802.1x. So it might be devices such as washing machines or presentation displays or sensors which you need to connect to your network, but they don't support any way of configuring 802.1x authentication. Well, one option we have within the Access Assurance solution is configuring what we call MAC Authentication Bypass, or sometimes known as MAC Auth. And this is where we're going to authenticate clients based upon just their MAC address. And it's fairly simple to configure. I've got a rule here in my authentication policies. We get to authentication policies from the organization menu, and under the access list of configuration options, this is where we configure access assurance. I go to authentication policies. And I've added a policy in here, and I've just called it MAC Auth. And my match criteria is a label called MAC Clients, and then the authentication type is MAB. That's MAC Authentication Bypass. So let's take a look at this label I've got called MAC Clients. Where have I configured that? Well, I configured that under Organization, Access, and Auth policy labels, and you can see I've got a label called MAC Clients. And if we look at this label, you'll see that it's of label type is a client list, and then I've got my values, and I can just put a list of MAC addresses in here. Now, in my list, I've only got one because this is just a demo, and I've just got one device I'm going to connect. But if you had, let's say, a group of temperature sensors, for example, maybe you could put all your temperature sensors and actually call its temperature sensors as your label name. For example, so we can create a list of MAC addresses that makes sense in there. So going back to my auth policy now, what this is going to do is if a client connects which has a MAC address in this list and they're doing MAC-based authentication, so MAC Authentication Bypass, it's going to allow them access. So how do we enable this inside Juniper Mist? And there's two places we might want to do this MAC-based authentication. We might want to do it for clients connecting to a switch, or we might want to do it for clients connecting to a wireless LAN. So for wired connections, we're going to do this through switch templates. I've got a switch template here. And for the authentication server, we're going to select Mist Auth. That's just saying use the Access Assurance Cloud as your authentication server, which we've just configured. And then we need to create a port configuration for our devices. So if this is for IoT devices, I might create an IoT port profile. And inside here, I'm going to select use .1x authentication and then say use MAC authentication. I've also said only use MAC authentication as the only method of authenticating these IoT devices. And then I can apply this port profile to any ports I want on my individual switches. For a wireless network configuration, we're going to do this when configuring the SSID. I want my Mac off SSID first of all. This is my Mac off SSID, and I've configured it with a pre-shared key. It's just a static pre-shared key that all devices are going to have. But then I've selected MAC address authentication by radius lookup. So it's going to go to a radius server to look up the MAC addresses. And then under authentication servers, again, I've selected Mist off to say, go to the Mist Access Assurance Cloud and use that as your radius server. And that is it. That is the configuration. So if I now connect a client to this Mac off SSID, we can see we haven't had any hits on this policy today. So let's see if I can generate a hit by connecting a client up to this SSID. I'm just going to one of my clients now, and the client that we've put the MAC address in for. So I've now connected up a client to this policy. So if I just do a refresh here, we can now see the hit count is 1. And if I show NAC events, we can see that I've got a NAC client access allowed event, and it's of type MAC authentication bypass. It's the SSID's MAC off, and the client connected meeting its rule. And to meet that rule, it must have had the MAC address, which I'd configured in my list, which we also see here. So that's how we simply configure Mac off using the Access Assurance solution. One of the problems I get with using Mac authentication is that it is quite easy to spoof a MAC address. So if you could get hold of that pre-shared key and do a capture and see which are the valid MAC addresses using it, you could spoof one of those MAC addresses and get on the network. And obviously, when we have one pre-shared key for all devices, it can sometimes be a bit difficult keeping that secret because the whole point is it's pre-shared. Everybody knows it. So another alternative to dealing with these devices would be to use per device or multiple pre-shared keys. And when I say per device, it could be per individual device, or maybe we could have a group of devices using the same pre-shared key. And this solution is what Juniper Mist calls its IoT Assurance. So let's take a look at how we might configure this. What we can do is we can come into our organization, and under wireless we can select pre-shared keys. And here we can see that I've got a pre-shared key which I've called temperature sensor. I've said it's for my SSID called IoT. I've assigned a VLAN that anything connecting to this SSID must connect. Anything with its pre-shared key needs to use VLAN 100. I've configured a pre-shared key. I've configured an expiry time for this pre-shared key. I've given it quite a long one because I'm not going to be changing it that often. So this one's going to last till next year, till 2 years' time. And then I've said for this one we can use multiple users, which multiple pre-shared keys can connect using it. And when I look on the registered clients, I can see that I've actually had 3 different MAC addresses all use its pre-shared key. Maybe they're 3 different sensors I've got connected. But currently, I only have one active client using it, and I just recently connected this client up to the IoT SSID. Let's have a look at the configuration for that SSID then. So it's the SSID called IoT, and we've said this is WPA2 with pre-shared key, and it's using multiple pre-shared keys. We've said, and where is it getting that list of pre-shared keys? It's from its local database that we've just looked at, the pre-shared key. So that's how this is configured. Another thing worth mentioning out, if we look back at that pre-shared key, in its temperature sensor, I've given it a role called IoT. That's a little bit like when we authenticate users and they belong to a particular group. And a radius of might return which group you're in. This is returning an IoT role, an IoT group. And that allows me to be able to configure policies based upon that role if I want to inside the Mist UI. So let's look at what we can do with this IoT role. If I look in if we come to organizations and labels, what I want to do is I want to use that role in a policy to control what IoT devices can and can't get access to. So I'm going to create a label. And I've already created this label, but I've got one called IoT. And all I'm doing is saying that role, which will be returned in an AAA attribute called IoT, I want to create a label for anything that gets assigned that IoT role, and I'm calling my label IoT as well. Then I've also got a label here called Office LAN, which is the local corporate LAN, which I don't really want my IoT devices to get access to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to then come in here and go to my wireless LAN template, and I'm going to create a new policy. So I'm going to add a role into my policy, and I'm going to add in here, I'm going to say any device that matches my IoT label, I would like to deny access to the local office, to the Office LAN. And I've just now enabled that rule there, so they won't be able to get access to that subnet, and I can save that, and I've now defined a policy based upon the role that was returned from the pre-shared key. Now, the final type of devices I want to think about in this video is, what about BYOD devices? So bring your own devices. These are going to be employees, so people who have corporate credentials on my network, but bringing their own personal device. So they're not necessarily going to be connecting to the 802.1x network. I'm not going to be pushing out certificates to personal devices. I want to allow them on the network using pre-shared keys and using per user pre-shared keys, but I want to control access and only allow my valid employees to generate and get pre-shared keys for access onto the BYOD network. That's how I want to provision the keys out. So we do that through the client onboarding profile. So we're going to come to organizations and client onboarding. And I create a client onboarding profile, and it's just a captive portal that users are going to receive access to. And I've got one created here. If we look at how it's set up, I've said it's the portal type is a BYOD SSO. I've given it a name, and it's automatically generated the portal address, which I will give to my users to generate pre-shared keys. Or alternatively, you might have like some sort of tablet in reception, which or touchscreen device which employees can go to and generate their own pre-shared keys. But we've got a portal address. On the portal authorization, this is where you're going to configure it with a third-party identity provider, something which can do a SEML login. So wherever you store your user credentials. Now, in my case, I'm using Okta to do this, and the certificate and the SSO URL are things you get from Okta when you create an app to do this SSO. So if I just quickly nip over to Okta, I'll need to re-sign in to it. So just give me a second to do that. When we sign in here under applications, there's an application I've created. I'm not going to go into how to create it, but it's just creating a new SEML application. And when I click into this, you will see that under sign on, we've got this URL, which we can copy the link off, and we also can generate a certificate as well here. And it's those two bits of information, the certificate and the URL that we need to paste into here. And Mist will generate a portal URL for the Okta to redirect users to once you've logged in. So we'll need to copy that, and again that will need to be pasted into the application you create in Okta. So we can see we've got that copied and added into here. It's just the same URL for all of these that we're using. So once we've got our portal authorization, we can then set up our pre-shared keys. And we want to generate pre-shared keys for the SSID BYOD. It's going to put users on VLAN 1. We've specified it's going to be 8 characters and a combination of letters, numbers, and these special characters. It's going to be valid for 6 months. And we're going to put users into this role called BYOD. So that's a role I'm going to define. And again, that role allows me to create a label called BYOD as well, matching that role name. And that again allows me to configure policies. So I can say BYOD is not allowed access to the local LAN, for example. Maybe they're only allowed out to the internet. And then here is my BYOD SSID. I've configured it for multiple passphrases, local, so that's ready to go in terms of an SSID that users can connect to. So let's look at how that portal works. If I just pull up this onboarding portal, and I'm going to copy this URL. I'm just going to open an incognito window to paste it into, because I'm already logged into. And we'll see it redirects me to Okta and says sign into Okta. So I am going to sign into Okta. Click sign in. That's me forward a one-time passcode, which I will just enter. Click verify. It's then going to redirect me back to the Mist portal. And what it's done is it's generated me a pre-shared key for the BYOD network. Now I could just scan that if I wanted on my phone, and it will automatically join the BYOD network and connect me up with that pre-shared key. You can see I can also email the passphrase to me, and it's now emailed it to my Peter@Mackenzie Wi-Fi address. And it tells me it's valid for 182 days. If we now take a look back in Mist and we go to organizations and pre-shared keys, we can see there's a new pre-shared key created called Peter@Mackenzie Wi-Fi. And that is how simple it is to configure a BYOD system where users can authenticate with their corporate credentials, but then get generated a unique pre-shared key. So thank you for watching this video, and see you next time.